The dawn was just breaking as Joe Diggle pulled his aging, battered sedan into the farthest corner of the Oxbridge Academy parking lot. He always chose the same spot, tucked away from the newer, shinier vehicles that lined the closer spaces. The car's peeling paint, rusted edges, and dented bumper made it look out of place in the pristine campus environment. With a heavy sigh, Joe turned off the wheezing engine, which gave one final cough before falling silent. For a moment, Joe stayed there, his hands gripping the cracked leather of the steering wheel. The faint smell of gasoline lingered, a constant reminder of the car's stubborn, temperamental nature. He muttered softly, "Well, old friend, we made it another day." It wasn't much of a reassurance, but in Joe's world, it was enough. Reaching for the thermos on the passenger seat, Joe gave the dashboard a gentle pat, as if thanking the car for surviving one more journey. The early morning air outside was cool, tinged with the earthy smell of dew settling on the grass. Joe stepped out, pulling his jacket tighter against the crisp breeze. The world around him was still waking up, birds chirped faintly, and the distant rumble of a delivery truck broke the quiet. He inhaled deeply, savoring this brief moment of peace before the day's work began. With practiced ease, Joe retrieved his trusty cleaning cart from the maintenance shed. It squeaked softly as he wheeled it down the empty hallways of Oxbridge Academy, the sound echoing in the stillness. The faint hum of fluorescent lights illuminated the polished floors, which gleamed like glass thanks to his careful attention. Joe took pride in this, the quiet, unassuming kind of pride that comes from a job well done, even if no one notices. Inside one of the classrooms, Joe paused to inspect a stubborn scuff mark near the teacher's desk. He knelt, his knees protesting from years of hard work, and scrubbed it clean. His reflection wavered faintly on the polished floor tiles, and he allowed himself a small smile. "Looks like you're ready for another day," he murmured to the empty room, his voice low and warm, as though speaking to an old friend. Joe's days followed a predictable rhythm, sweeping, mopping, scrubbing, and repairing. To most of the students, he was just Mr. Diggle the janitor, a quiet figure who blended into the background. Yet Joe knew their names, their quirks, even their dreams. "Good morning, Marcus," he'd say, greeting the boy who always arrived early with a stack of books under his arm. "How's that science project coming along?" Or, "Hey Jenny, I saw that goal you scored yesterday, impressive." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that often went unnoticed, grounding the students in a world where someone cared. Outside the polished halls of the academy, life was far less orderly for Joe Diggle. The small house he called home stood on the edge of town, weathered but sturdy. The framed photograph of his late wife sat on the mantelpiece, her kind smile a bittersweet reminder of the life they had built together before cancer had taken her 10 years ago. Since then, Joe had been everything: father, provider, protector. Every dollar he earned went toward giving his 2 kids a better chance at life. His son dreamed of becoming a mechanical engineer, sketching blueprints late into the night. His daughter had a passion for teaching, often borrowing books from the school library to practice lessons on her younger cousins. Their aspirations filled Joe with pride, even as the weight of their shared struggles threatened to overwhelm him some days. He worked long hours, enduring aching joints and calloused hands, not because he wanted recognition, but because he knew his sacrifices mattered. Yet, as he tightened the same worn bolts on his old sedan or scraped together enough to replace its sputtering battery, Joe often wondered how much longer he could keep going. One day at a time, he'd remind himself, his voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. It was a mantra born of necessity, a quiet resilience that had carried him through the darkest of times. Joe's quiet determination didn't go unnoticed, though he had no idea anyone was paying attention. One student in particular, Barron had been observing him with growing curiosity. Barron was different from his peers, a reserved, thoughtful boy who often found himself watching rather than participating. Raised to value people over possessions, he noticed the things others didn't: the way Joe greeted everyone with a warm smile, even when he looked tired, or how he quietly fixed broken locker handles before anyone could report them. One afternoon, as Barron waited outside for his ride, he caught sight of Joe hunched over the hood of his car. Smoke curled faintly from the engine as Joe worked tirelessly, his sleeves rolled up and hands smeared with grease. The Florida sun beat down mercilessly, but Joe pressed on, coaxing the old vehicle back to life with a mix of determination and familiarity. When the car finally sputtered to a shaky start, Joe wiped his forehead with a rag and muttered under his breath, "That's my girl." He climbed into the driver's seat, the faintest smile of relief crossing his face. Barron couldn't shake the image. The more he noticed about Joe, the more questions he had. Why did someone as hardworking as Joe Diggle drive a car that barely ran? How did he show up every day with the same kindness and care, despite what seemed like unending struggles? These questions lingered in Barron's mind, sparking an idea he couldn't ignore. One afternoon, Barron decided to approach Joe. He found him by the lockers, fixing a broken hinge with the same meticulous care he gave to everything else. "Hey, Mr. Diggle," Barron began hesitantly. Joe glanced up, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Well, hello there, young man. Need something fixed?" Barron shook his head. "No, I wanted to say hi. You're always fixing things. Do you ever get tired of it?" Joe laughed, a deep, genuine sound that carried the weight of his years. "Oh, sure. But someone's got to do it, right? Besides, there's something satisfying about making things work again." Barron nodded, the wheels in his mind turning. "You do a lot for this school, you know." Joe shrugged, his smile softening. "It's just a job, son. Nothing fancy." But Barron didn't see it that way. To him, Joe Diggle was more than a janitor. He was a cornerstone of the school, a quiet force who made life just a little bit better for everyone. And for the first time, Barron felt compelled to do something that would show Joe just how much he mattered. Barron Trump couldn't shake the conversation he'd had with Joe Diggle. The man's resilience and quiet dedication were more than just admirable, they were inspiring. That evening at the dinner table, Barron sat quietly, pushing his peas around his plate as his parents discussed their day. He couldn't keep Joe's image out of his mind. The man, sleeves rolled up, fixing a locker hinge with the same care a sculptor might give a masterpiece. And that car, its sputtering engine, the plume of smoke, and the way Joe had muttered, "That's my girl," as though the battered vehicle were a loyal companion. "You know Mr. Diggle, the janitor at school?" Barron asked suddenly, breaking the rhythm of his parents' conversation. His father looked up from his plate. "The one who's always smiling?" "Sure, I've seen him." Barron hesitated, gathering his thoughts. "I think we should help him," he said, his voice quiet but steady. His mother tilted her head, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Help him? How?" Barron set his fork down and met his parents' gaze. "His car barely runs. He's always fixing it just to get to work. And he works so hard, every single day, for everyone at that school. He never asks for anything, but he deserves more." His father leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing thoughtfully. "That's a big gesture, son. Do you have something specific in mind?" Barron nodded, his resolve growing. "I want to get him a car. Something reliable. Something he doesn't have to fix every weekend." His parents exchanged a glance, their faces a mix of surprise and admiration. "That's a generous idea," his mother said gently. "But cars aren't cheap. How do you plan to make this happen?" "I'll figure it out," Barron replied, his voice firm. "He's done so much for all of us. I can't just sit by and do nothing." The next day, Barron began putting his plan into motion. He knew he couldn't do this alone. During lunch, he approached a few close friends, leaning in to speak in hushed tones. "You guys know Mr. Diggle, right?" he began, testing the waters. "Of course," one of his friends said. "He's awesome." "Why?" Barron took a deep breath. "I want to get him a new car." His friends stared at him, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion. "Wait, like a whole car?" one of them asked, incredulous. Barron nodded. "Yeah. His car is falling apart, and he works so hard for all of us. I think it's time we did something for him." "That's huge," another friend said. "How are we supposed to pull that off?" "We'll figure it out," Barron replied, his tone resolute. "I'm not asking for a lot from anyone, just whatever they can give. If we all chip in, even a little, it'll add up." Word began to spread quietly through the school. Barron approached teachers, coaches, and even the school counselor, explaining his idea with the same quiet determination. The responses were overwhelmingly positive. "Mr. Diggle is one of the hardest working people here," a teacher said, slipping a $50 bill into Barron's hand. "Count me in." The small contributions began to grow. A jar labeled for Mr. Diggle appeared in the teacher's lounge, and students started adding their pocket change and lunch money. Barron's friends helped him organize a bake sale, with all proceeds going toward the fund. Slowly but surely, the dream of buying Joe Diggle a new car was becoming a reality. One evening, As Barron shared an update on the project with his parents, his father leaned forward, a thoughtful look on his face. "You're doing an incredible thing, Barron," he said. "But you'll need more than bake sales and donations to buy a car. Let me make a call." The next day, Barron's father reached out to a local car dealership, explaining the situation. The dealership manager, moved by the story, agreed to sell a brand new red Jeep SUV at a significant discount. "It's not every day you hear about a kid doing something like this," the manager said. "We're happy to help." Barron's father shared the news over dinner that evening. "The dealership's giving us a deal on the car," he said. "Your mother and I will cover the rest. But you've got to make this special for him." Barron's eyes widened in gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. "I promise, I'll make it unforgettable." As the pieces fell into place, Barron and his friends began planning the big reveal. After brainstorming with teachers, they decided the upcoming Friday assembly would be the perfect stage. Everyone would be there, and they could present the car in front of the entire school. The excitement in the school was palpable. Students whispered about the plan in hallways, careful not to let Joe overhear. Teachers coordinated logistics behind the scenes, ensuring everything would run smoothly. A group of students painted a massive banner that read, "Thank you, Mr. Diggle," decorating it with messages of gratitude. Late one evening, Barron stood in his room, practicing the speech he would give at the assembly. The note cards in his hands felt heavier with every word he rehearsed. "How do I say this right?" he muttered, pacing back and forth. "How do I make sure he knows how much he means to all of us?" His mother appeared in the doorway, a soft smile on her face. "You'll find the words," she said gently. "Speak from your heart, Barron. That's all you need to do." The morning of the assembly, Joe parked his old sedan in its usual spot. The engine sputtered and groaned before finally giving out with a resigned sigh. Joe sat there for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Another day, he thought. Another chance to keep things running. As he wheeled his cleaning cart down the hallway, the voice of the headmaster came over the intercom. "Good morning, students and staff. Please report to the auditorium for a special assembly. We look forward to seeing you all there." Joe barely registered the announcement. Assemblies were common at Oxbridge Academy, and they rarely involved him. He figured he'd use the quiet time to get ahead on some maintenance work. But as he reached for his mop, a teacher approached him with a smile. "You should come too, Mr. Diggle," she said. "You're going to want to see this." Reluctantly, Joe followed the flow of students and staff toward the auditorium. He slipped into the back row, hoping to blend into the crowd. The room buzzed with excitement, though Joe couldn't quite put his finger on why. When Barron Trump stepped onto the stage, holding a stack of note cards, Joe felt a flicker of curiosity. He knew Barron, quiet, polite, always with a kind word in passing. Joe assumed the boy had done something impressive to earn a spot on stage. But as Barron began to speak, Joe realized this wasn't about the boy. It was about him. "I'm here today because there's someone at this school who deserves recognition," Barron said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Someone who makes this place better every single day." Joe's brows furrowed in confusion. He glanced around, wondering who Barron could be talking about. "I'm talking about Mr. Diggle," Barron continued. The room erupted in applause. Joe froze, his hands gripping the edges of his seat as Barron's words washed over him. For a man who had spent his life working quietly in the background, the spotlight was blinding. The sound of applause echoed through the auditorium, but Joe Diggle couldn't move. He sat frozen, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, his mind racing to process what was happening. Barron Trump stood on stage, his young face steady and full of purpose. Joe stared at him, trying to convince himself he had misheard. "This can't be about me," Joe thought, his heart pounding. "I'm just the janitor." But Barron's voice cut through his disbelief. "Mr. Diggle isn't just our janitor," Barron said, his tone filled with quiet conviction. "He's the man who shows up every single day to make sure our classrooms are spotless, our hallways shine, and our school feels like a second home. He's the one who fixes what's broken, whether it's a locker, a leaky faucet, or even our spirits when we're having a rough day." Joe felt his throat tighten. He glanced around the room and saw hundreds of faces turn toward him, their expressions filled with warmth and admiration. Some students were clapping so enthusiastically their hands turned red. Teachers nodded in agreement, their eyes glistening with tears. For the first time in his life, Joe felt truly seen. The lights dimmed slightly, and the large screen behind Barron flickered to life. A video montage began to play, showing clips and photos of Joe in action, mopping floors, repairing broken chairs, carefully arranging supplies in the custodial closet. The footage was interspersed with interviews from students and staff. "He always has a smile for you," a student said, her voice soft but earnest. "Mr. Diggle never complains," another admitted sheepishly. "Even when we make his job harder, he just keeps going." The audience chuckled at the honesty of the remark, but Joe couldn't laugh. He felt an overwhelming rush of emotions: gratitude, humility, disbelief. He hadn't thought anyone noticed these moments, let alone cared enough to capture them. The video continued, each testimonial a testament to the impact Joe had made. "There was this one time," a teacher shared, her voice cracking with emotion, "when I lost a student's backpack. I was panicked, but Mr. Diggle stayed late to help me search for it. We found it together. He didn't have to do that, but he did." Joe wiped at his eyes, his vision blurring as the final frames of the video showed the words, "Thank you, Mr. Diggle." Barron stepped forward again, his voice strong yet laced with emotion. "Mr. Diggle, we know you never ask for anything. You work hard, day in and day out, and you do it all with a smile. But today, we want to give something back to you." The applause swelled once more as Barron gestured toward the side of the stage. The double doors opened slowly, and the room seemed to collectively gasp. There, under the soft glow of the stage lights, was a sleek black MayBach, its polished surface gleaming like liquid glass. A massive banner above it read, "Thank you, Mr. Diggle." The crowd erupted into cheers and whistles, the sound almost deafening. Joe's jaw dropped, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. His eyes darted between the car and the students who had made this happen. It was too much, too big, too generous. He felt like he was dreaming. "Mr. Diggle," Barron said, stepping toward the edge of the stage with a set of keys in his hand, "this is for you. From all of us. Because we see you, we appreciate you, and we want you to know just how much you mean to this school." Joe's legs trembled as a teacher gently touched his shoulder. "Go on," she whispered, smiling through her tears. "This moment is yours." Slowly, Joe rose from his seat. The applause seemed to double in volume as he made his way toward the stage. His steps were unsteady, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief and gratitude. When he reached the stage, Barron held out the keys, his young face alight with pride and kindness. Joe stared at the keys for a moment before taking them, his hands shaking. He looked at Barron, then at the car, then back at the sea of faces cheering for him. The words he wanted to say were trapped in his throat, tangled with the overwhelming emotion of the moment. "I don't know what to say," Joe stammered, his voice barely audible over the applause. He turned toward the microphone, clutching it tightly as he searched for the right words. This is more than I could have ever imagined. I don't even know how to thank you." The room quieted, the audience hanging on his every word. Joe took a deep breath, his voice steadier now. "I've always believed that kindness isn't something you do for recognition. It's something you do because it's the right thing. And to see all of you come together like this, it means more than I can ever put into words." He paused, glancing down at the keys in his hand. Memories of long nights and hard days flooded his mind. The times he had walked miles to work because his car wouldn't start, the sacrifices he had made to keep his family afloat, the quiet hope that his efforts might one day lead to a better future for his children. "When my wife passed away 10 years ago," Joe continued, his voice breaking slightly, "I didn't think I'd ever feel this kind of joy again. She was my rock, my partner, and losing her left a hole in my heart that I didn't think anything could fill. But I had 2 kids to raise, and I knew I had to keep going for them." The audience was silent, many wiping tears from their eyes as Joe shared his story. "Every morning when I get up, I think about them. They're the reason I do what I do. They're why I work so hard. I want them to see that no matter what life throws at you, you keep pushing forward. You keep giving, even when you don't have much to give." Joe paused again, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "And now, because of all of you, I can give them a little more. I can get to work without worrying if my car will break down. I can take my daughter to her dance recital without wondering if we'll make it there. This isn't just a car, it's a blessing. One that will change our lives in ways you can't imagine." Barron stepped forward, and without hesitation, Joe pulled him into a tight hug. "Thank you," Joe whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me." The room burst into applause once more, the sound thunderous and full of love. Joe turned back to the crowd, his eyes brimming with tears. To everyone who made this possible, students, teachers, parents, you've reminded me of something I almost forgot. That no matter how tough life gets, there's always good in the world. There are always people who care. The headmaster stepped forward, placing a hand on Joe's shoulder. Mr. Diggle, he said warmly, this school is lucky to have you. You're not just part of this community, you're the heart of it. The applause reached a crescendo, students standing on their chairs as they clapped and cheered. Joe looked out at the crowd, his heart swelling with gratitude. For years, he had worked quietly, believing his efforts went unnoticed. But today, he realized just how much his presence had mattered. The roar of applause slowly faded as the assembly came to an end, but Joe Diggle still stood near the gleaming black MayBach, staring at it as though it might disappear if he blinked. His hands rested gently on the car's smooth surface, the keys dangling loosely from his fingers. Around him, students and teachers milled about, many stopping to offer him a handshake, a hug, or a few heartfelt words. Thank you for everything, Mr. Diggle, one student said shyly, her voice barely above a whisper. Joe smiled, his eyes still misty. You're welcome, sweetheart. Thank you for being a part of this. As the crowd began to thin, Joe felt a tug on his sleeve. He turned to see Barron standing beside him, his face a mix of pride and nervousness. Do you like it? Barron asked, his voice tentative. Joe let out a soft laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Like it? Barron, I don't even know how to describe what I feel. This is the kind of car I've only ever seen in magazines or on TV. I never imagined it would be mine. Barron grinned, the boyish pride in his expression growing. You deserve it, Mr. Diggle. Every bit of it. Joe placed a hand on Barron's shoulder, his voice low but steady. You didn't have to do this, you know. Just knowing that someone noticed, that someone cared, would have been enough. But this? This is beyond anything I could have dreamed. Barron's smile softened. I wanted you to know how much you mean to all of us. You're not just the janitor. You're part of what makes this school feel like home. Joe's children had been invited as part of the surprise, and now they approached the stage, their faces glowing with pride. His son, a tall and quiet teenager, was the first to speak. Dad, he said, his voice cracking slightly, this is amazing. You deserve this so much. Joe reached out to pull him into a hug, his emotions spilling over. Thank you, son, he murmured. It's all for you and your sister, you know. Everything I do is for you. His daughter, younger and full of energy, climbed into the MayBach's passenger seat, her laughter ringing out as she explored the luxurious interior. It even smells new, she exclaimed, running her hands along the leather upholstery. Joe chuckled, shaking his head. Careful in there, kiddo. I don't think they let people like us touch cars like this, let alone drive them. You're wrong, Dad, his son said firmly, his voice filled with admiration. You've earned this. Every bit of it. Later, as the excitement began to settle and the crowd dispersed, Joe found himself sitting in the driver's seat of the MayBach for the first time. The keys felt heavy in his hand, a weight that symbolized far more than just ownership. He ran his fingers over the steering wheel, marveling at the craftsmanship and elegance of the car. Barron appeared at the open door, leaning in slightly. Ready to take it for a spin? Joe looked up, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You sure they'll let me? I'm afraid I might scratch it just looking at it. Barron laughed. It's yours, Mr. Diggle. You can do whatever you want with it. Taking a deep breath, Joe turned the key. The engine purred to life with a smoothness he had never experienced before. It was a sound of reliability, of possibility, of a future that felt just a little bit brighter. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his children in the back seat laughing and pointing out the car's features, Joe felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead felt different now, not just because of the car, but because of the reminder that he was seen, valued, and loved. That evening, after the house had quieted and his children had gone to bed, Joe sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in his hands. The MayBach was parked in the driveway, its sleek silhouette illuminated by the glow of the streetlights. He stared at it for a long time, his mind replaying the events of the day. A folded piece of notebook paper sat on the table in front of him. It had been handed to him by a shy sophomore just before she disappeared into the crowd. Slowly, he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the handwritten message inside. Thank you for always being so kind. There were days when I felt invisible, but your smile reminded me that someone saw me. I hope today showed you how much you mean to all of us." Joe read the note twice, his vision blurring with tears. It wasn't just the car or the applause that moved him, it was this. The quiet acknowledgement of the little things he thought no one noticed. The realization that his kindness had rippled out in ways he could never have imagined. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket, where it would stay as a constant reminder of this extraordinary day. In the days that followed, news of the assembly spread beyond Oxbridge Academy. Students shared videos and photos on social media, and the story gained traction online. Comments poured in from strangers across the country, many sharing their own stories of unsung heroes who had touched their lives. Joe was stunned by the attention, but he remained humble. "If this inspires someone to show kindness or gratitude to the people around them," he said in an interview, "then it's all worth it. That's what matters most." At the school, the impact of the assembly lingered. Students began leaving thank you notes for teachers and staff, and a newfound sense of community blossomed. Joe continued his work, but now, every task felt lighter, every interaction more meaningful. One afternoon, as Joe polished the hallway floors, Barron stopped by to check in. "How's the car treating you, Mr. Diggle?" he asked, leaning casually against the wall. Joe looked up, his smile wide and genuine. "Barron, that car is like driving a dream. But you know what? It's not just the car. It's everything, the thought, the effort, the love that went into making it happen. That's what stays with me." Barron nodded, his face thoughtful. "You taught us all something, you know. About kindness, about doing the right thing even when no one's watching." Joe paused, resting his hands on the mop handle. "Well, you all taught me something too," he said. "That kindness isn't invisible. It matters. It changes things." Barron smiled, the sincerity in his expression unmistakable. "It does, Mr. Diggle. And you proved that." As Barron walked away, Joe stood there for a moment, the weight of those words settling in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace, not just because of the car or the recognition, but because of the connection, the reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave a lasting mark. In the days following the assembly, Joe Diggle's life felt transformed, not by the car alone, but by the overwhelming show of gratitude from the students and staff of Oxbridge Academy. The MayBach, parked in his modest driveway, was more than a symbol of luxury. It was a testament to the lives he had unknowingly touched. Every morning when Joe climbed into the driver's seat, the hum of the engine reminded him that kindness, no matter how small, could ripple outward in extraordinary ways. But beyond the shiny car and heartfelt notes, the most profound change lay in how Joe viewed himself. For years, he had worked quietly in the background, believing his contributions went unnoticed. Now he understood that his dedication had meant something, that even the simplest gestures, like fixing a locker or offering a smile, had made a difference. One crisp Friday morning, as Joe pushed his cleaning cart through the familiar halls of Oxbridge Academy, he paused near the gymnasium. He heard the faint sound of students laughing and chatting, and curiosity drew him closer. Peeking through the open doors, he saw a group of students gathered, painting signs for an upcoming pep rally. Barron Trump sat among them, carefully lettering a banner with bold strokes of blue and gold. Joe hesitated, unsure if he should interrupt, but one of the students spotted him. "Mr. Diggle," she called, her face lighting up. "Come check this out." The room grew quieter as Joe stepped inside, pushing his cart aside. "What are you all working on?" he asked, his voice warm and curious. Barron stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Pep rally posters," he explained. "We want them to look good for tomorrow's game." Joe nodded, his eyes scanning the colorful creations spread across the floor. "You're doing great work," he said sincerely. "These will really brighten up the place." Barron gestured to an empty chair. "Want to help? We could use an extra hand." Joe chuckled, holding up his palms. "I don't know, Barron. Art's never been my strong suit." "Come on, Mr. Diggle," one of the students chimed in, grinning. "You've got to be good at something besides mopping floors." The room erupted in laughter, and Joe couldn't help but join in. Reluctantly, he sat down, taking a paintbrush that Barron handed him. "All right," he said, a playful grin on his face. "But don't blame me if this ends up looking like a kindergartner did it." As Joe dipped his brush into a pot of paint, the students around him began to chat again, their voices blending into a lively hum. He listened as they shared stories about their week, their excitement for the upcoming game, and their plans for the weekend. Joe realized how much he had missed moments like these, being part of something, even in a small way. Later that day, as Joe finished mopping the main hallway, Barron approached him. The boy's usual quiet confidence was tinged with hesitation. "Mr. Diggle," Barron began, "can I ask you something?" Joe set the mop aside and turned to face him. "Of course, Barron. What's on your mind?" Barron shifted on his feet, glancing down at the floor. "How do you keep going? I mean, when things are hard. When it feels like no one's paying attention." The question caught Joe off guard. He studied Barron's face, noting the flicker of vulnerability in the boy's eyes. "That's not an easy question," Joe admitted, his tone thoughtful. "But I guess for me, it comes down to two things. First, I think about my kids. They're my reason for everything I do. Knowing that I'm giving them a better chance, it keeps me moving forward." Barron nodded slowly, his expression contemplative. "And the second thing?" Joe smiled gently. "The second thing is remembering that even if no one notices what you're doing, it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Sometimes, the impact you make is invisible, but that doesn't mean it's not there." Barron looked up at him, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "I think I get it," he said quietly. "Thanks, Mr. Diggle." Joe placed a hand on Barron's shoulder, his grip firm yet kind. "You're a good kid, Barron. You've got a big heart. Don't ever lose that." The story of Joe's surprise at the assembly continued to spread, not just within the school but far beyond. Local newspapers picked up the story, framing it as a testament to the power of community and the importance of recognizing unsung heroes. Social media buzzed with photos of Joe standing beside the MayBach, his face a mix of shock and gratitude. Strangers left comments praising the students' initiative and Joe's quiet dedication. One evening, as Joe sat on his front porch watching the sunset, his phone buzzed with a notification. A news segment featuring his story had just aired, and friends from his old neighborhood were reaching out with messages of congratulations. "Joe," one message read, "you've always been the kind of guy who puts others first. It's about time someone put you first." Another read, "This couldn't have happened to a better man. You've inspired us all." Joe read each message carefully, his heart swelling with gratitude. But amidst the praise, one thought remained clear in his mind: this wasn't about him. It was about the community that had come together, the students who had shown him the power of kindness, and the simple truth that small acts could lead to extraordinary moments. The following week, during a quiet moment in the staff lounge, Joe found himself sitting beside one of the teachers who had been instrumental in organizing the surprise. She looked at him, her expression warm. "You know, Joe," she said, breaking the silence, "this school feels different now. Since the assembly, there's this energy. Students are kinder to each other. Staff are more connected. It's like everyone was reminded of what really matters." Joe nodded, his gaze distant but thoughtful. "It's funny," he said softly. "I spent so many years thinking my work didn't matter, that I was just another face in the background. But now, I realize it wasn't about being noticed. It was about showing up, every day, and giving my best. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough." The teacher smiled. "More than enough, Joe. You've reminded all of us that even the smallest things can make a big difference." That night, as Joe prepared for bed, he stood at the window of his modest home, looking out at the MayBach parked in the driveway. The car gleamed under the moonlight, a stark contrast to the battered sedan it had replaced. But it wasn't just a car, it was a symbol of the love and appreciation that had been quietly building around him for years. He thought of the students, their laughter and chatter filling the hallways. He thought of Barron Trump, the boy who had seen him not just as a janitor but as a person who mattered. And he thought of the note from the shy sophomore, still tucked safely in his pocket, a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, could change lives. Joe smiled to himself, a deep sense of peace settling over him. "Kindness," he murmured, "isn't just a gift. It's a legacy." With that, he turned off the light and headed to bed, his heart full and his spirit renewed. The story of Joe Diggle and the incredible act of generosity by Barron Trump isn't just about a MayBach or an assembly, it's about the quiet heroes in our lives who often go unnoticed. Joe's dedication, his kindness, and his resilience remind us of the power of showing up and giving your best, even when it feels invisible. But perhaps what stands out even more is the young man at the center of this story, Barron Trump. As the son of a former president, Barron could easily have stayed in the background. Instead, he chose to step up, to pay attention, and to use his influence for good. It's a choice that has sparked conversations. Is this what we expect from someone with privilege? Or does this act challenge the stereotypes we've built around public figures? We'd love to hear your thoughts. What does this story mean to you? How has it inspired you to think differently about kindness, community, and the impact of small actions? Leave your comments below. We want to hear your perspective. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Who in your life has quietly made a difference? NCE. And how can you show your appreciation? Sometimes, the smallest gestures, like saying thank you or lending a hand, can create ripples far beyond what you imagine. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see the world. Together, we can spread kindness and celebrate the people who make a difference every day. Let's keep this conversation going, because kindness isn't just a gift, it's a legacy.